Here we are in week 12, and just a reminder that your exam 2 is going to take place at the end of this week. So be ready for that. Now, you don't have a discussion board this week because we have the exam, but be aware that the material from this week, the key terms on the outlines, the concepts, the readings, they will be tied into this exam 2 on Friday. So make sure that you have watched this lecture, you've gone over the lecture notes if you need to, and you've read the readings for this week because that material will appear on the exam. So as we discussed last week, during the 1820s and 1830s, numerous social movements arose that worked to reform American society. Their inspiration lay primarily in the Second Great Awakening, the religious revivals that swept both North and South and offered salvation to sinners and improvement to society at large. Most notable among reform movements in the North was the new, militant movement demanding the immediate abolition of slavery and the incorporation of blacks as equal citizens to the Republic. The abolitionists helped to focus discussions of freedom on the sharp contradiction between freedom and slavery. They promoted an understanding of freedom as control over one's self and participation as an equal member in society and political life. They helped place the issue of slavery squarely on the national agenda in the early to mid-19th century. And now slavery is a pretty big topic, so this lecture is a bit longer than the last few weeks, but shouldn't be too bad. And it's broken into parts, so like always, you can take breaks if you need to. Now, in an age of self-made men, no American rose more dramatically from humble origins to national and international distinction than Frederick Douglass. Born a slave in 1818, he became a major figure in the crusade for abolition, the drama of emancipation, and the effort during Reconstruction to give meaning to black freedom. Douglass was the son of a slave mother and an unidentified white man, possibly his owner. As a youth in Maryland, Douglass violated the state's law by learning to read and write, initially with the assistance of the owner's wife, and then after her husband forbade her to continue with the help of local white children, which he would actually trick into teaching him how to read and write. He would say, "Oh, I bet you can't spell that," or "I bet you don't know what word that is." So he'd actually trick some of them into teaching him how to read and write. From that moment, he later wrote, he understood that knowledge was, quote, the pathway from slavery to freedom. It's important. Douglass experienced slavery in all its variety, from work as a house servant and as a skilled craftsman in a Baltimore shipyard to labor as a plantation field hand. When he was 15, Douglass's owner sent him to a slave breaker to curb his independent spirit. After numerous whippings, Douglass defiantly refused to allow himself to be disciplined again. This confrontation, he recalled, was the turning point in my career as a slave. It rekindled his desire for freedom. In 1838, having borrowed the free papers of a black sailor, he escaped to the North. That's when he's older. Frederick Douglass went on to become the most influential African American of the 19th century and the nation's preeminent advocate of racial equality. He who has endured the cruel pangs of slavery, he wrote, is the man to advocate liberty. Douglass lectured against slavery throughout the North and the British Isles, and he edited a succession of anti-slavery publications. He published a widely read autobiography that offered an eloquent condemnation of slavery and racism. Indeed, his own accomplishments testified to the incorrectness of prevailing ideas about black people's inborn inferiority. Douglass was also active in other reform movements, including the Campaign for Women's Rights. During the Civil War, he advised Abraham Lincoln on the employment of black soldiers and became an early advocate of giving the right to vote to emancipated slaves. Douglass died in 1895 as the new system of white supremacy based on segregation and disenfranchisement was being fastened upon the South. Throughout his career, Douglass insisted that slavery could only be overthrown by continuous resistance. Those who profess to favor freedom and yet deprecate agitation, he declared, are men who want crops without plowing up the ground. They want rain without thunder and lightning. They want the ocean without the awful roar of its many waters. In effect, as you've read for this week, Douglass argued that in their desire for freedom, the slaves were truer to the nation's underlying principles than the white Americans who annually celebrated the 4th of July, while allowing the continued existence of slavery. Now, the reason why I've opened today's class with a discussion of Douglass is because not only did he accomplish great things in a time when American society largely worked to battle African American education and success, but also because his life and works span the rest of the semester. Douglass seemed like a good jumping-off point to begin these last weeks, in which we will discuss many of the things that affected Douglass's life, including slavery, sectionalism, Civil War, and Reconstruction. So let's begin with discussing slavery in the Old South. When Frederick Douglass was born, slavery was already an old institution in America. 2 centuries had passed since the first Africans were landed in Virginia. After abolition in the North took hold, slavery had become the peculiar institution of the South, that is, an institution unique to Southern society. The Mason-Dixon line, pictured on this map here, drawn by 2 surveyors in the 18th century to settle a boundary dispute between Maryland and Pennsylvania, eventually became the dividing line between slavery and freedom. Despite the hope of some of the founders that slavery would die out, in fact, the institution survived the crisis of the American Revolution and rapidly expanded westward. During the first 30 years of Douglass's life, the number of slaves and the economic and political importance of slavery continued to grow. In 1790, the slave population was less than 700,000. 30 years later, in 1820, the slave population was just over 1.5 million. In 1860, on the eve of the Civil War, the slave population had risen to nearly 4 million. Its high rate of natural increase more than making up for the prohibition of the Atlantic slave trade in 1808. In the South as a whole, slaves made up 1/3 of the total population, and in the cotton-producing states of the Deep South, around half. By the 1850s, slavery had crossed the Mississippi River and was expanding rapidly in Arkansas, Louisiana, and eastern Texas. In 1860, 1/3 of the nation's cotton crop was grown west of the Mississippi. In the 19th century, cotton replaced sugar as the world's major crop produced by slave labor. And although slavery survived in Brazil and the Spanish and French Caribbean, its abolition in the British Empire in 1833 made the United States indisputably the center of New World slavery. Because the early industrial revolution centered on factories using cotton as the raw material to manufacture cloth, cotton had become by far the most important commodity in international trade, and 3/4 of the world's cotton supply came from the southern United States. Throughout the world, hundreds of thousands of workers loaded, unloaded, spun, and wove cotton, and thousands of manufacturers and merchants owed their wealth to the cotton trade. Textile manufacturers in great places as far-flung as Massachusetts, Lancashire in Great Britain, Normandy in France, and the suburbs of Moscow depended on a regular supply of American cotton. To replace the slave trade from Africa, now this is size of slave holdings in 1860, and you can see that the darker colors indicate more slaves per slave holding. To replace the slave trade in Africa, which had been prohibited by Congress in 1808, a massive trade in slaves developed within the United States. Very rarely did slaves travel west with their families and owners. Most slaves were forced to walk across the South chained together. They were devoid of human interaction. The death rate was lower on this second Middle Passage than it was on the passage across the Atlantic, but it was still higher than the death rate at that time. The slaves were not fed enough, they were not given clean water, nor were they allowed to rest enough on their long journey. Once they arrived in this new land, they had to farm a new crop, cotton. They were working longer hours and even more physically demanding labor. They had lost all semblance of a life they had had back east. More than 2 million slaves were sold between 1820 and 1860, a majority to local buyers, but hundreds of thousands from older states to importing states of the lower South. This is from 1823, this sign here. Slave trading was a visible, established business. The main business districts of southern cities contained the offices of slave traders, complete with signs reading Negro sales or Negroes bought here. Auctions of slaves took place at public slave markets, like the one you hopefully have read or will read about this week in New Orleans, or at courthouses. Southern newspapers carried advertisements for slave sales. Southern banks financed slave trading. Southern ships and railroads carried slaves from buyers to sellers. And Southern states and municipalities earned revenue by taxing the sale of slaves. Virtually every slave owner at one time or another bought and sold slaves. The Cotton Kingdom could not have arisen without the internal slave trade, and the economies of older states like Virginia came increasingly to rely on the sale of slaves. Slavery, Henry Clay proclaimed in 1860, quote, forms an exception to the general liberty prevailing in the United States. But Clay, like many of his contemporaries, underestimated slavery's impact on the entire nation. The free states had ended slavery, but they were hardly unaffected by it. The Constitution, as we have seen, enhanced the power of the South in the House of Representatives and Electoral College, and required all states to return fugitives from bondage. Slavery shaped the lives of all Americans, white as well as black. It helped to determine where they lived, how they worked, and under what conditions they could exercise their freedoms of speech, assembly, and press. Northern merchants and manufacturers participated in the slave economy and shared in its profits. Money earned in the cotton trade helped to finance industrial development and internal improvements in the North. Northern ships carried cotton to New York and Europe. Northern bankers financed cotton plantations. Northern companies insured slave property, and Northern factories turned cotton to cloth. The lords of the loom, New England's early factory owners, relied on cotton supplied by the lords of the lash, Southern slave owners. Northern manufacturers like Brooks Brothers supplied cheap fabric called, quote, Negro cloth to clothe the South's slaves. There was no single South before the Civil War. In the 8 slave states of the Upper South, slaves and slave owners made up a smaller percentage of the total population than in the 7 Deep South states that stretched from South Carolina west to Texas. The Upper South had major centers of industry like Baltimore and Richmond, and its economies were more diversified than those in the Deep South, which was heavily dependent on cotton. Nonetheless, slavery led the South down a very different path of economic development than the North's, limiting the growth of industry, discouraging immigrants from entering the region, and inhibiting technological progress. The South did not share in the urban growth experienced by the rest of the country. This is, I'm sorry, the caption is cut off. This is the Port of New Orleans in the 1820s and 30s. In the Cotton Kingdom, the only city of significant size was New Orleans. With a population of 168,000 in 1860, New Orleans ranked as the nation's 6th largest city. Unlike most other cities with slavery, New Orleans also attracted large numbers of European immigrants. In 1860, 40% of the population was foreign-born, and New Orleans' rich French heritage and close connections with the Caribbean produced a local culture quite different than that of the rest of the United States, reflected in the city's distinctive music, dance, religion, and cuisine. Also in 1860, the South produced less than 10% of the nation's manufactured goods. Many Northerners viewed slavery as an obstacle to American economic progress, but as New Orleans showed, slavery and economic growth could go hand in hand. It's an important fact about New Orleans. In general, the Southern economy was hardly stagnant, and slavery proved profitable for most owners, and we will continue in part 2.